The champagne glass trembled in his hand, not from age, but from the words that had just been spoken. "Let's raise a toast." The groom's voice rang out, smooth and polished, echoing through the glittering reception hall. "To a man who taught us all that life doesn't require ambition or achievement." Laughter rippled through the guests like breaking glass. At table 12, hidden near the swinging doors to the kitchen, Theodore Grant sat rigid, his suit stiff at the shoulders. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't even look at his daughter, who sat beside her new husband, eyes lowered, the diamonds at her ears catching light she couldn't meet. He only stared at the bubbles in his glass, rising quickly, bursting silently. Humiliation has a sound. It's the hush that comes after polite laughter, the silence that folds in on itself. Theodore knew that sound well. Hours earlier, the house had been quieter than a church. Dust swirled through the thin strips of morning sunlight as he buttoned his navy jacket in front of the mirror. The fabric hung loose on him now. Grief and years had stolen the weight from his frame. On the dresser lay a simple envelope, cream-colored, edges worn from the way he'd handled it all week. Inside, his savings, $20,000, his entire life, condensed into ink on a check. He'd pressed the envelope flat, turned it over again and again, as though smoothing it would give it dignity. "Enough," he whispered into the silence. "It has to be enough." By the door, his late wife's photograph rested against the umbrella stand. Eleanor in her sundress, laughing at some forgotten joke. Her eyes seemed to follow him as he picked up the envelope and keys. "Wish me luck," he murmured, and for a moment, he thought she might answer. Now, sitting in that glittering reception hall, Theodore felt the envelope burning in his pocket like a secret. Around him, polished conversations flowed. Stock markets, ski trips, overseas schools. Waiters in black uniforms glided past with trays of champagne, never slowing for the man who looked like he didn't belong. But the worst wound wasn't the laughter or the words. It was the sight of his daughter, Vera. Her head bowed slightly, lips pressed thin. She didn't laugh at the toast, but she didn't stop it either. Theodore's chest tightened. In her silence, he recognized something more cutting than cruelty. Shame. The kind a child feels when they've decided their parent no longer fits into the life they're building. In the corner of the hall, through floor to ceiling windows, the Pacific stretched out like endless glass, the sun bleeding gold across the horizon. Theodore shifted his gaze toward it, away from the crowd, away from the mocking smile of the groom, away from the ache that had lived in his chest since Eleanor died. Outside that window was escape. Inside was his daughter. He tightened his grip on the champagne glass. One thought anchored him, steady as stone 3 nights before the wedding. Theodore sat at his kitchen table with the lights dimmed low, the house around him creaking like an old ship in harbor. His checkbook lay open, its pages worn and curling at the corners. He had written the number twice already, 20,000, and torn both slips out, only to crumple them and leave them in the wastebasket. The third attempt sat neatly in front of him now, the ink still fresh. His signature a little shakier than he remembered it used to be. He pushed the check across the table as if handing it to someone, then pulled it back, practiced it again. The gesture felt hollow, a stage rehearsal with no audience. The knock at the door came at dusk. He already knew the rhythm. Micah never knocked twice, he tapped once, sharp, impatient, the way you'd knock on a service door you assumed would open for you. When Theodore opened it, Micah's cologne swept in first, expensive and sharp. Vera followed, stepping carefully in her heels, her expression somewhere between daughterly affection and unease. "Dad," she said softly, brushing her lips against his cheek. He caught the faintest whiff of Eleanor's old perfume on her skin. Though it was just something designer now, not the cheap bottle Eleanor had kept by the sink. Micah glanced around the living room like an appraiser in an antique store. His eyes landed on the sagging sofa, the chipped coffee table, the stack of unopened mail. He smiled thinly, as if confirming something he had already decided. Theodore gestured for them to sit, but Micah stayed standing. The venue alone. Micah began, adjusting his cufflinks, 35,000, catering, flowers, the quartet, all handled by my father. Vera deserves something unforgettable. You understand. Theodore nodded, the check burning a hole in his pocket. I want to help, he said. The words scraped out of him, dry and too small for the weight they carried. Micah's gaze dropped to the checkbook on the table. For the first time, he smiled, genuinely. even warmly. But there was something behind it. Pity maybe, or victory. When Theodore slid the check across the table, Vera's eyes flicked down at the amount. Her throat worked as if she might protest, but no words came. Micah picked it up delicately, like it might stain his fingers. He scanned the numbers, and a chuckle slipped from his mouth before he caught it. "Generous," he said finally. "But my father spends more than this on flowers." Theodore's face burned, but he didn't take the check back. He kept his hand flat on the table, waiting for something, gratitude, reassurance, anything. Vera reached out, touched his wrist gently, then withdrew. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, and the way she said it carried no accusation, no affection, just distance. They left soon after. The door shut softly, like a lid closing on a box. When the house fell silent again, Theodore sat alone with the check still lying in the middle of the table. His life's worth, reduced to paper that nobody wanted. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the shadows creeping along the wall, and thought, maybe I really don't belong in the life my daughter is building. The morning of the wedding smelled of salt and gasoline. Theodore's old Honda coughed its way up the coast highway, out of rhythm with the procession of polished black cars and glossy SUVs that sped past him toward Malibu. He gripped the wheel tighter, a pressed envelope sitting on the passenger seat like an uninvited guest. He hadn't slept. All night, he'd lain in bed, rehearsing lines he never found the courage to write down, words for his daughter, words for himself. Words that might bridge the canyon that had opened between them. But dawn came, and all he had was the envelope, his outdated suit, and a heart beating too fast for a man his age. When he pulled into the country club lot, the valet raised his eyebrows at the Honda's dented fender. Theodore pretended not to see. He handed over the keys, slipped the envelope into his inside pocket, and stepped through glass doors that hissed shut behind him. Inside was a world he no longer recognized. Crystal chandeliers, silver trays, guests in sleek gowns and tailored tuxedos, drifting through the marble lobby with the ease of people who had never questioned their place at the table. Theodore's shoes squeaked against the polished floor, too loud, drawing stares that flicked over him and then away. At his table, tucked near the kitchen doors, he kept his back straight, his hands folded tight around the envelope. He told himself it didn't matter that he sat at the edge, or that his daughter was too busy smiling at other guests to notice him. He told himself just being there was enough. Then the microphone clicked on. Micah stood at the head table, his glass raised high. His smile gleamed like it belonged in a magazine. "Family," he began, "is the foundation of everything we build. Tonight, I want to honor one very special man, Vera's father." 200 heads turned. Heat flared across Theodore's cheeks. Micah's words were sugar at first, or a man of simplicity, content in modest living. Then the sugar sharpened into glass. "When he offered to help with our wedding," Micah said, chuckling, brought out his checkbook with the pride of a man offering his very last $20. "Honestly, that's probably what it was." Laughter swelled, not cruel at first, polite, nervous, then louder as the crowd took its cue. Theodore froze. His grip on the envelope tightened until the paper bent. He looked at Vera, pleading silently for her to stop this. She only pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate. The room blurred. He heard the clink of crystal, the polite laughter, but it all seemed underwater. For the first time, he wondered if Eleanor had been wrong. If love really wasn't enough. If sacrifice really did fade into nothing when measured against wealth. Then a voice deeper, steadier, cut through the noise. "Wait." The laughter died. At the head table, Micah's father, Buford Thompson, was staring across the room at Theodore, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide. "Wait just a damn minute," Buford said, pointing at him. "Aren't you?" Theodore blinked. A storm was coming, but not the kind he'd expected. Electric storm. Buford's voice thundered across the room, echoing over the sea of startled faces. "That's who you are. You're Theodore Grant, lead singer. I saw you at the Forum in '96. Sold out crowd, front row." The name struck the room like a dropped chandelier. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. Guests craned their necks, whispers flashing across the hall like sparks catching dry grass. Theodore didn't move. His hands pressed flat against the linen tablecloth, the envelope still creased between his fingers. He hadn't heard that name in years. Not like this, not spoken with awe, but with certainty. For decades, Theodore Grant, had been a father, a widower, a man scraping by, not a frontman, not a voice that once filled stadiums. I knew it, Buford said again, pushing back his chair with such force it toppled. He moved quickly, almost boyishly, down the aisle between tables, his tuxedo, his wealth, all of it seemed shed for a moment, replaced by the fervor of a fan recognizing his idol. You signed my girlfriend's shirt that night. He laughed, gripping Theodore's shoulder with both hands. We played your cassette until it melted in the car stereo. Midnight Highway, Thunderroll. Hell, those songs were our youth. Theodore forced a thin smile, but inside, his chest felt like stone. He could feel every eye in the hall drilling into him, not with ridicule now, but something worse, expectation. They wanted a show. They wanted a confession, a story, a reason. Micah stood frozen at the head table, microphone slack in his hand. His smile, once razor-sharp, had fractured into something pale and fragile. He looked at his father, at Vera, then back at Theodore, as if the ground had tilted beneath him. Vera's face was the one that broke Theodore's heart. She stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time, her lips parted, tears brimming but refusing to fall. The shame he'd glimpsed in her earlier had vanished, replaced by something closer to disbelief and regret. You walked away. A voice called from another table. You were at the top, and you just disappeared. Theodore's throat tightened. He could feel the moment building, like a guitar riff climbing toward a break. He had avoided this truth for decades, burying it beneath fatherhood, beneath Eleanor's illness, beneath modest living. And now, under chandeliers and polished silverware, it threatened to rise. He reached for his glass of water, his hand trembling. The room waited. Buford leaned in, eyes shining. Tell them, he urged. Tell them why. Theodore glanced at Vera. Her tears had finally slipped free, tracing thin silver lines down her cheeks. He saw his Eleanor in her then, not in the diamonds or the designer dress, but in the rawness of her face. This was it. The moment when silence would no longer protect him. The moment when his sacrifice would either be understood or dismissed as nothing. Theodore inhaled slowly, the weight of the years pressing against his ribs. Then, with the microphone trembling in his hand, he finally began to speak. Theodore held the microphone like a relic, his reflection caught in its chrome. The silence in the banquet hall was absolute, a silence that begged to be broken, but feared the weight of what would follow. He drew a breath, felt it scrape his throat. Yes, he said, his voice rough but steady. I was Theodore Grant. I was the voice you heard on radios, the man you screamed for in stadiums. I was the face on posters that lined your walls. Gasps rippled through the guests. Cameras were lifted discreetly, phones angled. But Theodore wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his daughter. I walked away. He continued, his gaze locked on Vera, his words sharpening with every syllable. I walked away from contracts, from fame, from a life most men would have killed for, because a hospital room was more important. Because a little girl's bedtime story meant more to me than another encore. A flicker of memory washed over him. Vera at 7, curled against his chest as he hummed her to sleep, Eleanor's thin hand in his at the oncology ward. The noise of those days, the roar of fans, had been replaced by the hum of machines and the sound of his daughter's laughter. That had been enough. I spent everything I had. Theodore said, voice thickening, every dollar, every song, every ounce of myself. Not on cars, not on houses, on keeping my wife alive for as long as God would let me. And when the music industry moved on, when the lights dimmed, I didn't regret it. His hand trembled, but his words did not. Because I had something better. I had her. He pointed the microphone toward Vera. Every head in the hall turned. She flinched at the weight of it, tears spilling freely now, her shoulders shaking. Theodore's voice dropped, intimate, almost a whisper. So when you laugh at me, when you call me small, when you treat my life like it amounts to nothing, understand this, I gave up the world to be her father. And I'd do it again tomorrow. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, not a breath, not a fork against china. The chandeliers above seemed frozen in mid-glitter. Then, from the head table, Buford rose to his feet. His applause cracked through the silence like a gunshot. 1, 2, 3 claps. Before others joined in, the sound spread, rising, building, until the entire hall was on its feet. This wasn't polite clapping, the kind Micah's toast had earned. This was thunder. Chants began. Electric storm, the old name, resurrected. Strangers cheered, some with tears in their eyes. as if remembering a piece of their own youth that Theodore had unknowingly carried for them. But the only applause that mattered came from Vera. She stood slowly, her gown shimmering, her face streaked with mascara. She didn't clap. She simply crossed the room, past the tables, past the guests, until she was standing in front of him. Her voice cracked, "Dad," and just like that, the wall between them shattered. She fell into his arms, sobbing against his shoulder, like she had when she was a child. His old suit wrinkled beneath her designer gown, his weathered hands cupped the back of her head, steady and sure. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never saw it. I'm so sorry." Theodore closed his eyes, held her tight, and let the roar of the crowd fade into nothing. For the first time in years, he felt complete. The reception hall had not returned to itself. The applause still echoed in corners, but softer now, fading into murmurs, into the quiet music of a string quartet struggling to resume. Guests returned to their tables, but their eyes lingered on Theodore, as if reluctant to look away from the man who had just unraveled their laughter and rewoven it into reverence. Vera stayed in his arms for a long while, trembling. Her tears left dark stains on his jacket, her makeup smeared in streaks of honesty. When she finally pulled back, she didn't let go entirely. She clung to his hand like a child afraid of losing her parent in a crowd. "Will you walk me down the aisle?" she asked, voice hoarse. Theodore's throat tightened, the weight of years pressing against him. "Nothing," he said quietly, "would make me prouder." She nodded, swallowing hard. And for the first time in years, her smile was unvarnished. Not the polished curve she wore for photographs, but the crooked grin of the girl who used to dance on his shoes in the living room while Eleanor played piano. Across the hall, Micah stood motionless, his complexion pale under the chandeliers. When his father rose, urging him forward, he hesitated, then finally approached. His eyes met Theodore's, shame flickering like static. "Mr. Grant," he murmured, lowering his gaze, "I didn't know I was blind and cruel. I hope one day you can forgive me." Theodore studied him, long and hard. He thought of Eleanor's warning, that Vera would need him most when she pushed him away. He thought of the boyish arrogance that had nearly cost him his daughter. "You didn't know," Theodore said at last, his voice steady. "Now you do. Don't waste what you've been given." Micah's nod was small but certain, and for the first time, humility softened his features. Later that night, long after the vows, long after the music and the toasts, Theodore stepped outside alone. The ocean lay stretched before him, black and infinite, the horizon lit only by the pale shimmer of moonlight. The wind tugged at his suit, carrying the faint echo of the crowd still celebrating inside. He slid the envelope from his jacket pocket. The check inside, folded and bent, bore his signature like a scar. Worth everything, and nothing. He held it between his fingers, then tore it clean down the middle. The halves fluttered into the night air, carried off toward the sea. For the first time in months, he felt lighter. Behind him, the doors opened. Vera's laughter rang out, bright and unguarded, carrying across the patio. Theodore closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. Eleanor's laugh had once filled that same space. Now their daughter's voice rose in its place, a bridge across the years. Theodore turned back toward the light. The music swelled, the night alive with celebration. He straightened his shoulders, the weight of absence replaced by something steadier presence. As he stepped inside, Vera caught his eye across the dance floor. She mouthed the words, simple but whole, "I'm proud of you." Theodore smiled, not the wary smile of a man diminished, but the quiet, unshakable smile of a father who had given everything.